this is such a diverse subset of people where we have a common idea or thought that like we don't like these data centers. And so what I have found, which has been so remarkable to me, and I can say that I've never experienced this in my life, is what we are now calling like unusual allies, where people who likely like would never talk to each other, wouldn't even really be in the same spaces with each other, but because we have like this common enemy, like we're coming together.
Hey there. I'm Jesse Fox Mayshark, and this is Headlights, Voices from the Progressive South. Headlights is a production of the Progressive South, a nonprofit media platform dedicated to amplifying progressive voices and values across the southern United States. You can find out more about us, including how to support our efforts, at our website, theprogressivesouth.org. The voice you heard up top was LaTricea Adams, an environmental justice educator and organizer in Memphis, who founded and leads the nonprofit organization Young, Gifted, and Green. She talked about what she learned about environmental racism growing up in Memphis, how the community is organizing to hold Elon Musk accountable, and how resistance to data centers is forging new alliances. That's coming up. And in our arts and culture segment, as Pride Month begins, we'll remember a pioneering Atlanta native whose art wrestled with gender and transformation, often on the covers of paperback books. But first, the news roundup. This week, we'll hit on that feisty Texas Senate primary and look at the latest report predicting climate catastrophe for New Orleans and local reaction to it. And to start, more updates on political redistricting across the South. Louisiana remains on track to adopt a new congressional map that will eliminate one of the state's two majority black districts, which will likely have the effect of giving white Republicans 5 of the state's 6 congressional seats, even though about 1/3 of the state's population is black and votes mostly Democratic. As of this recording, on Friday, May 29th, the new map had passed the Louisiana State House and was headed back to the state Senate for final approval before going to Governor Jeff Landry. All of that will most likely have been completed by the time you're hearing this. But Alabama hit a real roadblock last week as it sought clearance from federal courts to change its congressional districts. The state is seeking to reinstate a map drawn after the 2020 census, which was blocked by federal courts that found it racially discriminatory. That forced Alabama to create a second district with a large black population, which elected Representative Shamari Figures, a Mobile Democrat, in 2024. After the U.S. Supreme Court's decision in the Calais case, Alabama asked the court to remove the block on its original maps. The Supreme Court sent the case back to the lower court for reconsideration. But on May 26th, the same 3-judge panel that found that map discriminatory in 2023 made the same finding again, even under the standards set by Calais. The panel, made up of 2 judges appointed by President Donald Trump and one by former President Bill Clinton, said the Alabama map appeared drawn to dilute the power of black voters. Specifically, the judges said the map breaks up the counties that make up the Black Belt of Alabama, a band across the southern half of the state that is home to much of its agriculture and much of its black population. The state is appealing to the Supreme Court, so this may be an early test of how the court's conservative justices are going to apply their new, narrowed interpretation of the Voting Rights Act. On the same day the court blocked the Alabama map, an effort in South Carolina to carve up the state's only black-majority congressional district fell short for the second time in a month. The Republican leadership of the South Carolina State Senate had resisted pressure earlier in May to redraw the map ahead of this fall's elections, and resisted again even after Governor Henry McMaster called them back for a special session to do just that. The state House passed the new map, but in the Senate, 14 Republicans joined with 12 Democrats to defeat it. Some Republican senators said they didn't want to interfere with early voting in congressional primaries, which also began on May 26 with tens of thousands of voters casting ballots. So depending on the outcome of the Alabama case, the total last-minute net for Republicans from breaking up black majority districts after the Calais ruling looks to be 2 or 3 congressional seats, at least for this year. Speaking of elections, of course, Texas had a doozy last week in the runoff for the Republican primary for U.S. Senate. Controversial, embattled, and indicted State Attorney General Ken Paxton overcame a massive fundraising gap to crush four-term incumbent Senator John Cornyn by a 64 to 36% margin. Cornyn, a staunch conservative who's been a strong supporter of President Trump, had many Republican establishment donors on his side, including former President George W. Bush and Fox News owner Rupert Murdoch. But Paxton, who has made a career out of ideological combat in his role as Attorney General, had the support of the Republican primary voting base, and also of Trump, although it's unclear whether the president's late endorsement in the race was much of a difference maker, given the scale of the win. With the primary settled, Paxton and Democratic candidate James Tala-freak-o immediately came out swinging at each other, with lines of attack that will be very well worn by November. Tala-freak-o and Democrats are bashing Paxton for the same allegations of corruption and scandals that Cornyn tarred him with, and Paxton and other Republicans are basically calling Tala-freak-o names. In a social media post, Trump advisor Stephen Miller falsely asserted that Tala-freak-o is transgender, a reference to comments Tala-freak-o has made about gender issues while serving in the Texas state legislature. Trump, meanwhile, keeps falsely referring to Tala-freak-o as a vegan. In other words, most of the attacks are that Tala-freak-o is one way or another not manly enough to represent a red-blooded, beef-eating state like Texas. The general supposition among commentators on the left is that Tala-freak-o has a somewhat better shot at beating Paxton than he would have Cornyn, because there are some centrist Republicans who may not vote for Paxton. Tala-freak-o obviously still has an uphill fight in a state that hasn't elected a Democratic senator since 1988. But if he's looking for reasons for optimism, the primary voting turnout is at least interesting. In the initial primary on March 3rd, more people voted in the Democratic race between Tala-freak-o and Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett than in the Republican primary. More than 2.3 million for the Democrats and about 2.1 million for the GOP candidates. Cornyn actually got more votes than Paxton in that round, but neither topped 1 million votes, while Tala-freak-o and Crockett both did. Republican turnout dropped by more than 50% in the runoff, with a total of just under 925,000 votes. Paxton took 587,000 to 330,000 for Cornyn. Which is to say, so far this year, Democratic voters in Texas appear more energized than Republicans. But of course, it's still a long time until November. It's not news that New Orleans faces climate-related challenges. The Crescent City famously sits in a shallow basin, and about half of its neighborhoods are below sea level. Its vulnerability to storms and floods has been demonstrated over and over during its 300-year history. But the warming climate has amplified those risks, with scientists projecting both stronger storms and rising sea levels. The most recent alarm bell came from a study in the scientific journal Nature Sustainability. It projected that sea levels in the Gulf of Mexico could rise anywhere between 3 and 7 meters, and that New Orleans could become an endangered island by the end of this century. The paper said, quote, "While climate mitigation should remain the first step to prevent the worst outcomes, coastal Louisiana has evidently already crossed the point of no return," unquote. Most dramatically, it called for plans sooner rather than later to begin to encourage people to move out of the city and the surrounding areas. All of this went viral via a detailed article on May 4th in the British newspaper The Guardian. And maybe predictably, it didn't go over too well with the people who live in New Orleans. It's not that New Orleanians are ignorant of or in denial about their precarity. It's that other people harping on at them about it gets old. An opinion column at the nonprofit media outlet The Lens by writer Christopher Ard called the Guardian article just the latest in a long string of obituaries for the city. He wrote, quote, "We here in New Orleans are acutely aware of our impending doom. Every summer thunderstorm now turns into a flood. The invasive Formosan termites are eating our oak trees and houses. The heat is the worst it's ever been. We're infested with destination bachelorette parties that rent our homes through phone apps, forcing us to live further outside of downtown with a long commute. And the earth beneath our feet is subsiding quickly, wrecking our roads, utilities, and the foundations of our homes. We know the levees are sinking, the governor doesn't like to build land, and the U.S. government doesn't care about climate change. We see it every year as our home insurance jumps by several $100s. We know. But, he said, many cities that people live in and love also face rising sea level threats, while others have earthquakes or wildfires. And dispassionate reasoning about the need to relocate a threatened population misses the magic that makes New Orleans, New Orleans. Ard noted the city has lost about 300,000 residents in the last 60 years, a trend that was well underway before it was accelerated by Hurricane Katrina in 2005. It is now down to about 361,000 people within city limits. More will probably leave, Ard wrote, but some will stay for as long as they can. He wrote, quote, "Please stop saying relocate New Orleans. That's not going to happen. You can move the cathedral to Jackson, Mississippi, the Superdome to Houston, your grandma's house in Treme to Atlanta, and it will not be New Orleans. Nowhere else will be New Orleans. We're a sinking ship that will not be here one day, just like every other city along the coast. And that's okay. Nothing is permanent, and it's that impermanence that makes us live and love so deeply here," unquote. The discourse was such that New Orleans Mayor Helena Moreno also weighed in with an op-ed at NOLA.com full of civic pride. She wrote that New Orleans had only ever been developed and sustained through human innovations to control flooding and drain waterlogged land, the levees and pumps and other infrastructure that the city both relies on and knows the vulnerability of, as Katrina illustrated. More innovations to come could suggest ways to protect the city through a changing climate, Moreno wrote. And she urged the researchers to work on that rather than endless warnings about future catastrophe. She wrote, quote, "New Orleans is one of the world's great cultural capitals and a critical economic engine for the United States. The Mississippi River Corridor, the port system, energy infrastructure, and global commerce tied to South Louisiana are too important to simply walk away. I challenge the scientists behind this report to try again and do something meaningful, this time focusing their expertise on identifying bold solutions that can help protect and sustain coastal Louisiana for generations to come," unquote. If you want to hear more local thoughts, I've linked in the show notes a podcast episode from The Lens dedicated to a full discussion of the study and the Guardian article. Also, one other update. Last week I talked about Alex Haley's book Roots being removed from school library shelves here in my home of Knox County, Tennessee. Well, it's back. The local and national outrage over the ban prompted School Superintendent John Ryswick to reverse the decision made by the district's in-house review committee. Ryswick said, quote, "Removing any book from circulation is and should be an immense decision. Our intent will always be to err on the side of access, which is the decision I have made with regard to Roots," unquote. However, the state law that led to the removal, the Age-Appropriate Materials Act, remains in place, and the 123 other books removed from Knox County shelves in an effort to comply with the law are still banned in the district. Okay, now we're to my interview with LaTricea Adams. She is the founder, president, and CEO of the Memphis, Tennessee nonprofit Young, Gifted, and Green. She grew up in Memphis and graduated from the University of Memphis in 2007 with a degree in Spanish. She subsequently earned a master's in education at Belmont University in Nashville and a doctor of education at Tennessee State University. She was working as an educator in the Washington, D.C. area in 2015 when news broke of the water crisis in Flint, Michigan. Government cost-cutting exposed the city's mostly black residents to high levels of toxins in their drinking water. Like many people, Adams was outraged by the story. Unlike many people, she decided to do something about it. She traveled to Flint to help distribute clean water and heard first-person accounts of the effects of lead poisoning and other contaminants. She formed an environmental justice group called Black Millennials for Flint, which over time morphed into Young, Gifted, and Green. With programs in Memphis, Flint, Baltimore, and Washington, D.C., it trains young people in environmental activism. It offers programs for middle, high school, and college students, including a Youth Environmental Justice Council that students serve on for 1 year, developing leadership skills. Other programs are aimed at millennials and Gen Zers in their 20s, 30s, and 40s. All of them focus on raising awareness of climate and environmental issues and providing tools for effective organizing and action. In Memphis, the organization has in recent years worked with the coalition Memphis Community Against Pollution to focus on issues surrounding Elon Musk's massive XAI data center project and its impact on local air and water. All of that was why I wanted to talk to Adams to hear more about her work. We had a really good conversation, so Seth, let's go to the tape. All right, LaTricea Adams, thanks so much for joining me.
Yeah, happy to be here.
So I wanted to start out by asking you just about a little bit of your own background. I know you grew up in Memphis, and I'm curious what you absorbed growing up in Memphis, sort of in terms of political awareness, and also given the issues that you're working on now. What was your sense of kind of the actual environment in Memphis as you were growing up?
Yeah. So, proud Memphian. If anyone knows folks from Memphis, we are very proud, to be natives. So with my family, interestingly enough, my parents, both were from the same neighborhood. They met as teenagers at a local store, such a cozy, kind of a story of how they met. So I spent a lot of time in a community called Riverside. So Riverside at one point, during the Jim Crow South was one of the places where only, African Americans could reside. But at one point, like, it was thriving. He definitely started to see like the rise of the Black middle class, but over time, we started to see a significant amount of divestment. And little did I know at that point, that it is definitely a frontline community. So in the Riverside community, there is a Valero refinery right next to Dr. Martin Luther King Park. And the proximity, besides just this refinery being right next door to a park, they're literally houses across the street, and the only thing that separates them is Highway 55. And so I remember as a child, like, going around a ramp literally to go to my grandparents' house, and you could literally smell when we almost got to grandma's house because it smelled like sulfur. And, as a child, you didn't really know why. And it just, became a unfortunate norm, right? Where it just happens so frequently. And for me, because both sides of my family, right? So like all of like my aunts, my uncles, my cousins, all, lived in this same community. It just felt like this is, maybe what happens everywhere. However, while my family all is from the Riverside community, I was not. So when I was born, my parents actually moved to a neighboring community called Whitehaven. It's where Graceland, where Elvis's mansion is. Now, we didn't live in a mansion. It is located. And for a while, like, that community, was very thriving, but still, fell prey to white flight. And then you started to see, significant divestment, but still not at the same scale as you saw in South Memphis. And so the reason why it's important for me to frame that is because of how I grew up. I literally grew up like in like a dichotomy. Mm-hmm. Like, I literally saw, the conditions in which, my family, like, this is where my parents, grew up, where they lived versus like where we lived. I mean, it literally was like very much like night and day. Mm-hmm. Even with the schools, that I attended, versus schools that, other members of my family attended. And so even like at a young age, that really sparked like something in me that I didn't know how to define it then, but I knew literally like at 5, like, this isn't right. And I don't like this. Clearly, like, being that young, like, I couldn't really articulate it, but as time progressed, like, that has always like centered me, like, around like literally, like, we live in a very dichotomous society, like, dare I say, like, the haves and the have-nots, but it's so personal that I'm like, this is not just the work that I do now, even like with education, even the work that I do now is to dismantle that, right? Is to consistently fight and advocate for equity, not equality, but equity.
Right. Right. Well, so jumping ahead a bit then, 2015, you were living and I guess teaching, working in education in the Washington, D.C. area. And the story comes out about the water system in Flint, Michigan being essentially polluted with all sorts of toxins because of some decisions that had been made by the local government. How did that get you engaged? And, I think lots of people read that story and were horrified by it, but not everybody decided, I'm going to go do something about it. So kind of what made you really decide this is something I need to actually address?
Yeah. So while I will say that I'm a unconventional woman of faith, I'll put it that way, especially being from a place like Memphis, because I was a teacher. I mean, like, I have dedicated my entire life to children. I know that is like why God put me here. And I remember there was a lot of things happening at that time. So you had like the rise of like Black Lives Matter. We saw significant like police brutality. It was a lot going on, right? But something about what happened in Flint literally just like crushed my spirit. Like, I mean, like I wept, and it was the imagery of the children. I remember, seeing, like photos. I remember like the Time magazine, like image of that child. And in fact, like, I know his aunt now, but that just, it just sent chills through my body. And I'm like, I can't believe, like at that time, it had been a whole year before I even learned about it, right? Like, and that's a problem within itself. I'm like, how could it be, that we're supposed to be such a developed country that something like this would happen, right? And it wasn't lost on me who it was largely happening to. And so at that time, I'm in DC. I actually had moved out of teaching in a classroom, but I worked like more in an administrative type of role. And the school that I worked at was actually a school for public policy. So we got to work on the Hill with kids. It was really cool. And so that's where the passion like around like policy really started to resonate with me, and which is why I really wanted to, if you want to work on policy, you got to move to DC, right? And so, also at that time, I was the president of, National Urbanly Young Professionals chapter. And so I got a lot of leadership development, like working, in that role, even though it was in a volunteer capacity. And so I pretty much like said, we need to do something about this. So the first thing I did was what everybody did, is did a water donation drive, which is nice. I'm like, this doesn't really get to the systemic issue around why this happened in the first place. And so honestly, with having like that civil rights like background, kind of blended in like with working directly with children and families, I was literally able to kind of like bring all of those things together. And I did a national call where I'm like, hey, y'all, this is a bigger issue. Like, Flint is a big issue, but guess what? Like, it's not just Flint. It was actually in DC. It was in Baltimore. It was in very, very similar, demographic types of cities. And so, on February the 10th, 2016 is when we had this national call. People ask like, why did we used to be called Black Millennials for Flint? It's so basic. That's literally who was on the call. It was nothing fancy about it at that time, over a decade ago. Millennials used to be the youngest. Gen Z, one adult. Right. We were the youth, right? Oh, to be young. And so, things moved very quickly. So unlike, Gen Z is on point, like very, knowledgeable around like environmental issues, because I think with my generation, we were warned about like, issues surrounding environment and climate, but we're in it now,
Mm-hmm.
And so it was a very interesting space and time, for millennials to really be invested in anything regarding environment. And so we blew up really quickly. I had no intentions of like starting a nonprofit. I thought I was just gonna, be a retired, K through 12 educator. But it was divine intervention.
Mm-hmm.
I really was obedient to like, it was a reason why I was so moved, by that in that moment. And I'm glad that I listened to that, where I'm still a teacher for life, but, in a different way. But had, the Flint water crisis not happened, even beyond just like how it impacted my life, it really just painted such a clear picture, not even nationally, but globally, not just about lead service line replacement, but like about like government corruption, really like calling out like environmental racism where you couldn't like skirt around it. It changed my life and the life of so many people forever. And I'm indebted to those organizers that I met on the ground in Flint. I love to shout this woman out, Naira Sharif, as a organizer and still organizes in Flint. And she used a lot of those tactics and strategies from the civil rights movement, door knocking, canvassing, those are the things, that our ancestors did. And to see that like they're still very much so useful, in today's time. So yeah, I owe a lot to Flint to where I am.
Well, and so you're continuing that kind of work now, right? So talk about Young, Gifted, and Green, and especially, I know a lot of what you focus on, it still is very much a youth-focused effort. I guess the word young is in the name.
Yes.
What are you doing, and who are you trying to reach, and what are you trying to teach?
Yeah, so we always use this catchphrase, like we're building the next generation of environmental justice leaders. I've been blessed to, serve in the same like rooms and roles and beside like, the greats like the father of the EJ movement, Dr. Bullard, Dr. Wright, Miss Peggy, from We Act. And, they have truly been amazing pioneers, but they deserve to rest. They've been literally doing this work longer than I've been alive.
Mm-hmm.
And it's really important for us to continue that work because we're not done. They made so many sacrifices, and I think that it is the next generation's responsibility to like take that work up. And so part of what we do with Young, Gifted, and Green is we really focus on leadership development and community organizing. And I always have to tell folks like, everybody doesn't have to be an activist. Activists are very important, but activists are a bit different than community organizers. They're different than like strategists. And so because, I do have that element, from civil rights and being from a city, like Memphis, and to be honest, because I very much so grew up deep into the church. My family very much so were devout Christians, spend a lot of time like in service at church, however, you decide that you want to worship or not. The way that church is structured from a ministry perspective is really helpful when you do nonprofit work. And so we really focus on building the capacity of young people, one, to understand like the depth and breadth of environment, because there's a lot of moving parts. Like you can't solve everything, So we kind of give young people like a bit of a canvas, like what is something that's like sets your soul on fire? Like that's your thing. We also focus on like diversity. Like everybody doesn't need to be like a scientist or an engineer. Like I was a teacher, you know? And so that's really cool that we not only just focus like on young people. And I say young people like millennials, even though we're grown and Gen Z and now Gen Alpha, as well. We have young people as young as like the 6th grade. And so they go to city hall meetings. They engage with legislators. They engage with rulemaking, like they literally engage, you know, with agencies. They set their own agenda, like based on what they desire to see within their own respective communities. The teacher in me still wants them to have skills. So we actually just launched, a program called a Youth Energy Assessor program, where we teach kids not only about like, you know, your carbon footprint, but also thinking about like their career pathways around energy efficiency. They get really excited about that because it's very engaging, but it's also very much so connected to environment, which leads me to like kind of like who we are as an organization. We want to be solutions brokers. So we really want children and youth and young people to be like the fixers. Like we know that there's a lot of things that are broken that you didn't do, that I didn't do, but I'm like, how do we work together to fix it? Right. So that is, you know, what we really instill and try to build with the youth, across a broad array of things that is versatile and not just specific to just environment. You know, you may run for office. We do have some people that are like in county commission seats now. We have people, you know, that went on to work for agencies. And so we really like to just have a lot of different touch points where environmental justice is more fluid and not so siloed, right? That we've seen for a long time.
Right, where it's just kind of this one issue out here with some small group of people working on it and not connected to the life of the communities around it.
Exactly.
Yeah. Well, and so to get a little bit specific, let's talk a little bit about Memphis. I know you all and several groups in Memphis have been engaged around the XAI data center there, which has had concerns raised about air pollution from gas turbines. And then most recently, this issue where they said they were going to build a water recycler. And then they said, well, you know, we'll probably get to that eventually. And in the meantime, they're going to be sucking up all this water. And all of this is happening, I know, just a few years after a fight over a pipeline that was going to come through, you know, essentially the same part of town. And that was successfully pushed away. So I guess what's the mood in Memphis around all of this, and what are you all doing about it? I know that it has had the support of local officials. It obviously has the support of state officials in Tennessee. So what are you trying to do to, I guess, hold it accountable?
Yeah. So, where to start? So one of the things that is really critical that was a misstep, whenever that contract was, so remember, we were all blindsided when we all learned about this project. It was really faulty, and it's really disappointing, and dare I say, like, embarrassing that our most like influential, powerful electeds and non-electeds that's supposed to be like these, you know, economic brokers, like they would have such a really like a bad deal. So, you know, I think it's important, and I hope that it's a lesson learned, at least for like decision makers, that when you go into a development conversation, one, it shouldn't happen behind closed doors. And that is very apparent now, that there should have been, of course, like engagement with community, but then also engagement like with people where this is their area of expertise. And so, because like there weren't very like explicit like benchmarks. There might have been like a deadline, but look at the patterns of the person that's responsible for this has not always kept his promises, right? It's a difference between a promise versus like something that is in a contract. So I did want to say that is, we really want to ensure that like we never have such a poor precedence that like if there is opportunity for any type of other development that there would be a much better approach. And when we say with a much better approach, we have to consider humans and the lived environment. And so when we think about like this, like, oh, we'll get to that later, like with the water reuse facility, like think about what that truly means. So Memphis is very unique where we have a natural sand aquifer. And with the aquifer, it's a wonder of the world. I mean, this is water that existed like when Jesus like was walking on earth. Like this is really old water, right? And so because it is a natural formed aquifer, if it's breached, it's done. Like it's done. And so it's not only just, the issue is not only that, XAI will still continue until we don't know how long now, right? To pull from our aquifer, the same, source of our drinking water. But where XAI is located, it's an industrial, like area. So you also have TVA, for example. So TVA is also supposed to be coming off of our drinking water source and also using this water reuse facility. So, what you may see like in headlines makes it seem like more narrow, but it's really more broad, right? And when you think about this from a planning and development perspective, you said you were going to like at least have like almost done, right? Like in 2026 to now saying like, oh, we're on a pause. And we're like, almost through with April. Like that's very concerning. And then also we're just really as a community consistently disappointed with our leadership. Like be the leader. This is unacceptable, and so some of the things that we are doing as a community, I want to uplift, protect our aquifer, who has been remarkable, with the work around, the water reuse facility, with making sure that we understand what this means, because it's very technical. I also want to lift up, Memphis Community Against Pollution, where we do work in coalition. And one of the things that we are doing right now is putting the pressure on leadership. Like you brokered this deal. The mayor brokered this deal. The Chamber of Commerce brokered this deal. Our utility, president brokered this deal. Have that same, chest stuck out. You were so proud to bring this into the community. Stand by that. And you need to hold them accountable. And so what we're doing is we're demanding a hearing. There needs to be a hearing with XAI, with everybody that was involved. So with XAI, with Memphis Light, Gas and Water, with the Department of Public Works, because if this was any other entity, would they not be held, to this same type of standard? Right? I'm like, they have to maintain their leverage, because if they don't get this right, it opens up Pandora's box for industry to run our city, as opposed to a fair democratic process where it's actually those who we checked off on a ballot box who's making the decisions for our city. So we are getting ramped up, to really put the pressure on our leadership, because the owner of XAI, they're not the mayor. They're still private sector. We're calling on those leaders of our city to hold private sector accountable.
Right. All right. Well, maybe to wrap up, I wanted to move from the local picture to the national picture, thinking about working in environmental justice, working on issues of environmental racism. These are terms that our current administration in Washington has more or less declared war on. I mean, the EPA is deleting every reference they can find to environmental justice and environmental racism. almost as if not talking about it makes it go away. So I guess, how are you all who work in the field responding to that, and A, not getting dispirited, but B, thinking beyond this administration? And what are the things that you're kind of trying to either keep alive or put in place to be able to push on when the environment changes?
You know what? We are in such a very unique space for more reasons than one. And I'm actually going to use data centers as the example. So even though, the terminology, like you can't say climate, you can't say environmental justice, like you can't say, all these various things. But what we can say all together is everybody is really upset about these data centers. This is uniting the country. I mean, you have Northern Virginia, one of the, richest areas, in the country, suburbs outside of DC, to like Memphis, to the Midwest, and Michigan, and rural farmland. This is such a diverse subset of people where we have a common like idea or thought that like we don't like these data centers. And so what I have found, which has been so remarkable to me, and I can say that I've never experienced this in my life, is like what we are now calling like unusual allies. Where people who likely like would never talk to each other, wouldn't even really be in the same spaces with each other, but because we have like this common enemy, like we're coming together. And so I even think about, from a personal perspective, because of, our work that has been happening in Memphis and it's like gone viral, right? We've been called into communities, to be honest, like I never even heard of before, to provide support on strategy, because, from an EJ community or from a large, Black, Latino, Indigenous, or tribal community, we're accustomed to having to resist and organize. But when you talk about like rural communities, when you talk about even like the suburbs, they are not like used to this, right? And so it's been really, I can't even really describe the feeling for people from communities that are like exactly up and down the exact opposite of mine, or people that look like me, that trust that like these strategies work, and asking like, can you help us? That's beautiful. And, not to like sound so sappy, but I would be remiss not to acknowledge like what Dr. King's dream was, but not the like I have a dream speech, but with the Poor People's Campaign. Poor People's Campaign, like he got it. He was just like, hey, we really have the same enemy. Like, like these rich people are creating, like divisive things among quote unquote common folk, but it's really, these like rich billion trillionaires that are robbing us blind. And I think that like this is like a point of reckoning for this country in the most unusual of times, right? When we are like from a social perspective, very divisive, very like nasty things that we see, whether it be on traditional media or in digital media. I think that it's an opportunity. One, where I know maybe we do have to adjust our language a little bit, and it is a point of reckoning, even as an EJ leader, where I have to listen to people when they say, well, when you say EJ, that makes me feel like that's not for me if I am a white person. I don't want you to feel that way, because I want you to know that you also live in a community that's polluted. Like in South Haven, Mississippi, they kind of just learned that like, y'all have air pollution too. But maybe because we were saying it in a particular way that wasn't resonating, like they didn't know. So how can we meet each other? How do we be mutually like supportive of each other and acknowledge like, ooh, that doesn't really work for me. Can, like you translate that for me? It's on both sides, like how can we use this moment to really heal and restore a country that had never been healed. And maybe that's just me being extremely optimistic, but I just feel it. I feel it in my bones. Like this is an important moment in time right now.
Yeah. Great. Well, that's a great and hopeful perspective. And definitely we do see that all over the country with this resistance to the data centers. No matter how often the Washington Post editorializes that everybody should just, be quiet and accept him. It's definitely interesting to watch. Well, thanks so much for your time. Thanks for your work. It's fascinating to hear about. And I really enjoyed it. Thank you.
Thank you.
It's June, which means it's Pride Month, even if here in Tennessee, the state legislature has decided to brand it as Nuclear Family Month. We'll be talking about LGBTQ issues across the South throughout the month, and also highlighting some voices from the South's array of queer communities, which you can find in every city and town across our region. This week, I want to highlight an artist who I just recently became aware of, although she was well known in some circles during her career. Jeffrey Catherine Jones was a transgender woman who was born in 1944 and grew up in Atlanta. Her father was in the military, and Jones, who was artistically inclined from a young age, reportedly did not have a happy childhood. After graduating from Georgia State University with a degree in geology and a keen interest in Vermeer and Rembrandt, she moved to New York City to pursue art full-time. In the mid-1970s, Jones rented a loft space in Manhattan with 3 other artists, and that's where she did what would become iconic work in the fields of fantasy and weird fiction. If you know Jones's work at all, it may be like I did without even knowing her name, as covers to paperback sword and sorcery and science fiction books by writers like Fritz Leiber and Andre Norton. She painted mysterious figures and hostile landscapes with dazzling colored skies and celestial bodies. Although she did not come out as transgender until the late 1990s, there are suggestions throughout her work of fluidity and metamorphosis. As the horror website Longbox of Darkness wrote in an appreciation in 2024, quote, "Her figures often seem caught in a state of transformation or revelation. They're heroic, yes, but also vulnerable and deeply human," unquote. That article includes several of Jones's most notable works, and you can find it linked in the show notes. Jones died in 2011 at the age of 67. She had suffered from emphysema and bronchitis. In an obituary in the Comics Journal, writer Steve Ringenberg wrote that Jones's personal journals showed that she had struggled with issues of gender her whole life. Using masculine pronouns, he wrote, quote, "Having grown up as a product of the patriarchal 1950s with a domineering war hero father, Jones did not know how to cope with his yearning to be female and felt ashamed. For years, he tried to drown these feelings in alcohol, but after much soul-searching, Jones realized that although he'd been born male, inside he was a woman. He began hormone replacement therapy in 1998 and set out upon a new phase of life as a woman, changing his name to Jeffrey Catherine Jones," unquote. That wraps us up for this week. Remember, the Progressive South is a nonprofit enterprise, and you can find information about supporting us on our website, theprogressivesouth.org. You can also reach out to me directly at jmayshark at theprogressivesouth.org. Thanks to our friends in Bark for our theme music, and to Lord Seth the Libertarian for his production work at Barbarian Productions. And thanks to you for listening. We'll talk to you soon.